Imagine for a moment that you are the tiniest little being living inside of a water droplet. And this water droplet is your entire world. It is your life. It is everything that you have ever known. And you just so happen to be moving throughout space and time. But the way that your tiny little being sensory system and nervous system detects this movement is almost negligible, meaning that you don't really feel that you're moving at all, except if you are consciously moving around in your little water droplet, meaning you're moving your body, you're moving your way to work, you're moving throughout your life. But there's something quizzical that happens where your brain, your nervous system, the way it processes all of that extraneous information about the water droplet being one in a line of other water droplets, making its way down to a much bigger ocean that you will eventually merge into. But this is all happening without your grasp of understanding, because how could you? Your perceptual experience is confined to the water droplet. And so as you make your way down, drip, you experience something perhaps cataclysmic. You experience something grand. You experience merging into almost another world that you had no idea existed. It's like you wake up one day and it's not the Mandela effect. It's like you're in another world, another reality, and it is discernible to you and everybody else who you share a pool with. How did you get there? You were a water droplet, making your way down the entire time, whether or not you realized it. Now, I believe that there are a subset of people that can actually guide their water droplets to different pools, but it takes effort, it takes practice, and it takes commitment, and it takes upgrading the sensory system and the way that you perceive the world. Meaning you have to be able to take the perspective of the eyes of the cosmos, watching the whole thing happen. And that's rather challenging. Some Buddhists might say that there's a word for it, the nothingness of existence. You have to dissolve away into something much further beyond the scope of your day-to-day existence and memories and life. And to do so is quite frightening. The ego death is actually really, really frightening, where I've done it several times actually, and now it's a lot easier to slip in and out. And I do it relatively often, I would say almost daily, in meditation. If I'm doing a manifestation meditation in particular, or a quantum meditation, I slip into different quantum identities and roles as I get closer and closer to some of those coming into fruition. And as I sort of parse together some of the manifestations that I have out in the ether. And so at first, though, I remember when I was first practicing this, I experienced fear, like actual flight or fight response. It was so weird. It almost felt like there was something inside of me that wasn't me, the conscious me, almost as though for a while I felt like I had a ride along, like this is great story. So I was in Sedona doing some wild quantum shifting, and I couldn't always sleep at normal times. when you start traversing the interdimensional spheres, A, it's really exciting. And B, time loses its meaning because you stop living a linear existence. And weird things happen, like you're not able to find hotels or Airbnbs, or your cards stop working. And that's why I recommend having cash if you're going to do some heavy matrix traversing quantum traveling. Although we might be in a cashless society soon, so take it where it applies. So things get messed up. Bank transfers get messed up. Messages get messed up. And so you find yourself sleeping in your car or driving at night and slipping through the time-space continuum and having some pretty wild experiences while listening to your favorite music, of course. And I was traversing one of those experiences that was kind of a little bit on the edgy side of things, where it was like I was slipping into a world that had a military presence that knew about this technology, and they weren't always super friendly. And I felt like there was a cohabitation of an ET presence that was hidden as well, that wasn't disclosed and was hidden. And I stopped by this construction place out in the middle of nowhere that, to my senses, even though the sign said it was a construction place, it did not feel like a construction place. And it was barricaded behind like a gated area. And I only stood, or parked in the driveway and stood in front of the gate. I didn't trespass or anything like that. But I perceived that there were some facilities that were cloaking a spacecraft. I'll just say it straight. And matrix technology. So from the outside, it looked like it was a construction site, but using the spider senses and reality shifting senses, it felt like it was a facade. And there were other places where I felt like that too, where I was like, oh, I'm driving out in the desert. Yeah, is that like a screen technology? Is that augmented technology? Because I'm pretty sure that looks like a hologram screen or something. It doesn't, there's a disconnect, right? Anyway, so I was approached by a being that I couldn't see with my physical eyes, but I could sense with my other senses. And they proceeded to accompany me and joined and melded with my body. And I drove them around Sedona for a couple of days. And it was interesting because I love to drive, and I'm taking a break from it presently, but I love driving. I just, especially in my Audi TT, when I could take the turns pretty much as fast as I wanted to, not like in my teenage years when I would try to take turns too fast and wreck my car because I was in a beat up old, like 4-cylinder that had no suspension whatsoever. And so when I upgraded my vehicles, I would just drive and drive and drive, and it was such a pleasurable experience. And in Sedona, there's this place right outside of it, I believe it's called Jerome, that has this amazing highway with this like mountainous road that is so fun to drive. And so when I was in that area, I would drive that road just for fun, like a couple times a day. And when I had this being that came out of this construction site join me, the being was afraid. Like, it didn't know that I was a driver. It didn't know that I knew my car. And so I would experience its fear through my emotional system, almost as though it was cohabiting my conscious awareness in my space. It was so intriguing. And after I think it was about 3 days, I dropped it back off and we departed. And it was a lovely experience. They gave me some guidance and some gifts and abilities. And I gave them a joyride. And we had a good time. So when you are breaking away from the ego, what you'll find is that you might have this feeling of a passenger inside of you that seems to be disintegrated from the conscious perceptual experience that you are. And in fact, what's interesting is that there's a famous cognitive neuroscientist, Dr. Michael Gazzaniga, who inspired me to go into neuroscience. My clients usually hear the story, but I haven't actually shared it on this series, and I'm not going to go fully into it, but there's a section of his work and some derivative work that came from the result of his split brain studies. You can look this up if you would like to. That is called alien hand syndrome. What does that mean? That means that when you sever the corpus callosum, the bundle highway that keeps the left and the right hemisphere connected, when you sever that, what you find is some really intriguing things. First of all, people are cured of severe epilepsy. So yay, science. Second of all, that the brain processes information laterally, and key bits of information only go to the left hemisphere or only go to the right hemisphere. Good, yay, science. And C, the third thing, is that some people have a different persona in them that will try to take over, that only live in the right or the left side, apparently. That part might be a little bit of a stretch if I remember. But so, for example, there's this story about this woman who has alien hand syndrome, and she was one of the split brain patients, and she's confused because she doesn't smoke, but I believe it was her left hand, but it might have been her right hand, keeps trying to light cigarettes. And when she goes into a closet and tries to pick out clothes, one side of her body is fighting with her on the clothes to wear. What? How is this possible? Well, think about it for a moment. You might have another person inside of you. And this is why I say that sometimes people, especially to follow up the conversation or the monologue, forgive me, about substances and the relationship with substances, some people have demons under the hood. And this is what I mean by that. That when you take the conscious mind, when you have a brain injury, when you drink too much, or you alter your neurochemistry in certain ways, what you'll find is that the person under there is not your everyday person. And in my case, and in other people's cases, it is often more affectionate, more loving, but it is the world that has trained us to be harder, to be tougher. And in some cases, what you'll find is that there is a damn monster inside. And the last thing you want to do is give somebody a couple drinks, and they're tearing up the house, and they're tearing up you, and they don't know how to control it. And perhaps if we took them to Dr. Gazzaniga's office and split their brain, perhaps we would find that they would have alien hand syndrome too. Perhaps. So, as the ego death occurs, you may find that there is this resistance. There's this resistance to letting go of the construct of the everyday you that you have always been comforted by. Indeed, it is comforting to just be that little microscopic being in the water droplet, falling from space with no concept except for you and the world that you've ever known. But when you start to shift your perspective and you start to join and merge with unity consciousness, and not every collective has unity consciousness, but By all reports, it appears that we are headed that way. Some people call it hive mind, but I feel like that has a connotation that's kind of creepy. And so when you start to shift away from your ordinary individual experience of your life, you begin to upgrade your perceptual system to see other worlds, other lifelines, other conscious beings, even if you can't detect them with your eyes, and other pools of water. When I was traveling, it seemed that there were 4 or 5 different collectives out there. And nobody teaches us. We all just assume there's one. There's not. There's actually more. And that was just in, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So when you start to break down the ego and you slip into the observer from a higher perspective, from the eyes of the cosmos, you can zoom all the way out and you can see that the emotional experience of the life that you've always known, living in that one little droplet of water, is so finite. It is so temporary. And it does have the effect of making you laugh at yourself at some of the emotional reactions that you have, because it feels so pressing. Everything feels so pressing when you're in the perspective of your singular water droplet. And yet it's also so ordinary. It's so important and yet so ordinary at the same time. And so when you start to move beyond, you start to realize that the passage of time, the passage of eternity, is really a slow death, because everything that you've ever known gets stripped away through that experience. And perhaps a lot of people, they never leave their little water bubble, and that's okay. And so they're not listening. They probably aren't listening to this. Well, I don't know, maybe. That everything gets stripped away when you realize how finite it is and how infinite it is at the same time. Because what happens is that the longer you go on the awakening journey, and I feel like I've been doing it eons, I know some of you too. I know from the human body perspective, the linear perspective, it seems very, very short. But, there are some places where people and time are reset for 800 to 900 years, and we reboot and do it all over again. And it's just annoying because we always get to the end and there's always like a swiper. There's, gotcha. And you're like, okay, we need new management team. We need a new program. We need to update something because this repetitiveness gets old after a while. Like, how many times do we have to go through the 7 deadly sins? How long have we been teaching about that, really? And you're going to tell me that the management team still hasn't learned from the 7 deadly. You're going to tell me that there's somebody like that that's oppressing humanity? Come on. That's just ridiculous. Like, how long have we been doing it? Seriously. Anyway, so it's a slow death because the longer you go about it, the more the construct of reality dies. And you get a lot out of it, but the more dissatisfaction you feel with being confined to one little droplet and one little pool in a world where people don't know or recognize or care, like the worst is when they don't care. I remember sitting around the table talking about reality shifting, and nobody cared. People were pulling out their phones, scrolling on Instagram, checking their messages, looking at me and saying, yeah, you should start a podcast. This was years ago. Your voice is really great. You should start a podcast. And I was like, I will. I will, when the time is right. So listen, I am a reality shifting coach and also an ascension coach for those of you who are called to the journey and experiencing an awakening. And what I do is I help you integrate beyond just the singular water drop. We open up your gifts, your abilities, and we figure out what pool you're dropping into naturally. And then if we can direct you to a different one, it's not always possible, but for a lot of awake people, it is, especially if you love the personal transformation journey. And if you have triggers and wounds, we work through that as well. So feel free to email me if you're interested in coaching at sacredjourneyproductions@gmail.com.